You're about to hear information that could save you from unnecessary fines or legal trouble during traffic stops in the United States. Every year, thousands of passengers encounter situations where law enforcement requests identification, and the consequences of responding incorrectly can be surprisingly serious. What most people don't realize is that the law draws a clear line between what drivers must provide and what passengers are legally obligated to show. But here's the question. If a passenger refuses to show ID during a traffic stop, is that a lawful exercise of their rights, or could it escalate into a citation or arrest? Let me know your answer in the comments below. According to official records and U.S. Department of Justice guidelines, traffic stops are considered seizures under the Fourth Amendment. This means that both drivers and passengers have certain protections against unreasonable searches and demands. While states differ slightly in their rules, the general principle is consistent. Passengers are not drivers, and the constitutional requirements that apply to drivers do not automatically apply to passengers. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has documented numerous stops across multiple states where passengers were asked for identification. In many cases, these stops result from routine traffic enforcement or when officers are investigating potential criminal activity. However, federal guidance and court rulings make a clear distinction. The police can request a passenger's ID, but refusal alone is generally not a criminal offense, provided there is no other lawful reason for the stop or detention. To understand how this works in practice, it's important to look at a few illustrative cases. In Hebel v. 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada, 2004, the Supreme Court held that states can require individuals to identify themselves if there is reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. However, this ruling primarily applies to situations where a person is suspected of a crime, and courts have consistently noted that passengers in a vehicle are generally not required to carry ID unless state law explicitly says otherwise. The plaintiff, in a 2018 case in California, alleged that officers demanded ID from passengers during a routine traffic stop, even though there was no suspicion of wrongdoing. The court cited state law and constitutional protections, ultimately emphasizing that passengers cannot be compelled to identify themselves simply because they are present in a vehicle. The department stated that officers are trained to request ID only when there is legal justification, and failure to produce ID under these circumstances cannot be the sole basis for an arrest. Let's walk through the typical scenario. Imagine a vehicle is pulled over for a minor traffic violation. The driver presents their license, registration, and proof of insurance. The officer then asks the passengers for identification. What happens next depends on the officer's knowledge of the law and the passenger's response. Many passengers, uncertain of their rights, comply immediately. Others politely decline, citing constitutional protections. From a legal standpoint, one interpretation is that passengers can ask whether the stop legally requires their ID. Another perspective raised in court is that refusal to produce ID might prompt further investigation, but cannot alone justify a citation or arrest. Officers are trained to document the interaction, and escalation typically occurs only if other factors indicate criminal activity. Some key turning points in these types of stops include the moment the officer first requests ID, the passenger's response, and whether the officer has independent reason to believe a crime is being committed. In several high-profile cases, improper demands for passenger ID have led to departmental reviews and changes in training procedures, reinforcing the principle that passengers have rights distinct from drivers. Given these facts, do you think passengers in the U.S. have enough clarity about their rights during traffic stops, or does this reveal a gap in law enforcement training? Share your thoughts in the comments. Consider a scenario documented in official police reports from several U.S. states. A vehicle is pulled over for a minor traffic infraction, perhaps a broken taillight or a lane change violation. The driver provides all required documentation. A passenger, sitting quietly in the back seat, is then asked to provide identification. According to official guidance from the American Civil Liberties Union and multiple state law enforcement manuals, passengers are not legally required to provide ID in most routine traffic stops. However, officers often ask for identification to verify everyone's identity in the vehicle. This is generally considered a request, not a legal demand. Here's what legal experts recommend. Remain calm, be polite, and respond factually. A common phrasing, which has been vetted by attorneys in recorded trainings, is, "Am I legally required to provide identification as a passenger in this state?" This question is crucial. It immediately clarifies the legal boundaries without being confrontational. Another recommended approach is, I am happy to answer questions, but I would like to know if I am legally required to provide ID. Both statements rely on neutral language, emphasize willingness to cooperate, and put the burden on the officer to explain the legal basis for the request. According to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, these phrases protect passengers from inadvertently admitting to wrongdoing or escalating the encounter. Let's examine the legal framework behind these interactions. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Courts have consistently distinguished between drivers who have a legal obligation to carry a license and registration and passengers who do not have the same statutory requirement in most states. One interpretation is that passengers should comply only if the officer can articulate reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, as required in cases like Terry v. Ohio, 1968, and subsequent rulings. Another perspective raised in state courts is that some local statutes may require identification in certain limited circumstances, such as checkpoints or investigations of specific crimes, but these are exceptions rather than the rule. During these stops, officers may continue to ask questions. Passengers should remember they have the right to remain silent and may politely decline to answer unrelated questions. According to documented cases in Texas and California, a passenger's refusal to provide ID cannot legally be the sole reason for detention. Only if officers develop additional reasonable suspicion or probable cause can further action be taken. An important turning point often occurs when the officer attempts to escalate the situation. For example, if a passenger provides a verbal refusal, officers may clarify, "If I ask you to step out of the vehicle or provide your information, this is within my legal authority." At this point, passengers should remain calm, maintain a respectful tone, and ask if there is a specific legal requirement. In nearly all documented incidents, this simple step prevents escalation while protecting constitutional rights. Court precedents reinforce these practices. In a 2015 ruling in California, a court found that a passenger's refusal to produce identification, absent any independent suspicion, did not constitute obstruction. The ruling stated that officers must have specific legal grounds before detaining passengers or issuing citations. Similar conclusions have been reached in New York, Illinois, and Florida courts. Here is a practical breakdown based on verified legal guidance. Stay seated and calm. Avoid sudden movements or argumentative language. Politely inquire about legal requirements. Use neutral, non-confrontational phrasing. Do not provide information beyond what is legally required. Only share your name if asked and if legally necessary. Observe and document. If the encounter escalates, remember details for potential legal follow-up. Know your rights. Federal guidance and state-specific resources outline passenger rights during traffic stops. By following these steps, passengers can exercise their constitutional rights while minimizing the risk of escalation. These procedures are fully documented in legal training manuals, attorney guides, and public records of court decisions. Given these procedures and court precedents, do you think most passengers actually know their rights during traffic stops, or does the lack of widespread public knowledge put many at unnecessary risk? Share your opinion in the comments below. Even with clear guidance, traffic stops can present moments of legal ambiguity. One of the most critical turning points occurs when an officer requests ID without articulating a reason. In documented cases from New York and California, passengers who politely requested clarification often diffused tense situations. Courts have emphasized that the lack of reasonable suspicion makes any attempt to compel identification legally problematic. For example, in a widely cited 2017 California case, a passenger refused to provide ID during a routine traffic stop. The officer insisted, citing department policy, but could not point to any law requiring passengers to comply. The court ruled in favor of the passenger, highlighting that departmental policy cannot override constitutional protections. This case underscores the importance of understanding the distinction between police procedures and actual legal requirements. Another common turning point arises when passengers are asked about their travel plans, associations, or destinations. While officers may pose these questions to gather context, passengers are under no obligation to answer unless there is an independent legal requirement. Experts advise using neutral phrases like, "I am willing to cooperate, but I do not wish to answer questions unrelated to the traffic stop." These interactions illustrate the balance passengers must strike, being polite and non-confrontational while asserting their legal rights. Many legal observers stress that tone and demeanor often determine whether an encounter escalates, not simply the words spoken. High-profile cases also shed light on the risks of misunderstanding passenger rights. In Texas, a 2019 incident involved a passenger who was briefly detained after refusing ID. The state court ultimately ruled the detention unlawful because the officer lacked reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Similar rulings have occurred in Florida and Illinois, reinforcing the principle that passengers cannot be compelled to present ID without legal justification. From a legal perspective, there are two main interpretations. Strict adherence view: passengers have the constitutional right to decline providing ID unless the officer has reasonable suspicion or specific state law authority. Courts consistently support this position. Practical compliance view: while not legally required, providing identification voluntarily may expedite the stop and reduce tension. Attorneys note that this is a strategic choice, not a legal obligation. It's important to note that certain limited situations may require passenger identification. These include checkpoints, e.g., DUI or immigration checkpoints, where state law may require ID verification. Investigation of criminal activity, where officers have reasonable suspicion specific to the passenger. States with unique statutes that explicitly demand passenger ID in narrowly defined circumstances. Even in these situations, legal experts emphasize that passengers should politely ask about the legal requirement. A clear example: "Officer, can you please clarify the law requiring me to provide ID as a passenger in this state?" This question establishes a factual record and demonstrates compliance while preserving legal rights. Looking at these incidents together, a few key lessons emerge. First, passengers must know their rights under the Fourth Amendment and applicable state statutes. Second, polite, factual, and neutral communication reduces the risk of escalation. Third, documentation and observation during traffic stops can be critical for legal recourse if disputes arise. In conclusion, passengers in the United States have clear constitutional protections that differentiate them from drivers. While officers may request identification, refusal alone is generally not a legal violation. Court precedents across multiple states confirm that passengers cannot be detained or cited solely for declining to provide ID unless specific legal conditions are met. Given these facts, do you think law enforcement should receive more training on passenger rights during traffic stops, or is the current system adequate? Share your thoughts in the comments. Remember, this is for informational purposes and not legal advice. Always consult a licensed attorney for guidance on specific situations. If you found this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing to our channel for more legal investigations, court analyses, and step-by-step explanations of your rights. Staying informed is the best way to navigate encounters with law enforcement safely and lawfully.